Hello and welcome. Let's talk today about the integumentary system. So before we jump into the integumentary system, let's go through and let's talk about the term dermatology. Here, dermatology is basically the study and the treatment of the integumentary system. Now, when we talk integumentary system, as you probably read from chapter 1, it consists of the skin, which we can also refer to as the integument, hair, nails, and the various cutaneous glands we're going to find. Now, when we talk about skin, skin is the body's largest organ. It is the body's largest organ, and usually when cadavers are dissected, the skin most of the time is, especially in educational institutions, is removed off as one piece. So that way you could understand it as being the body's largest, as being the body's largest organ. Now, when we go through and we talk about skin, skin is composed of epidermis, which is the more superficial region. It's the epithelium of our skin, and the dermis. And the dermis. The dermis is the connective tissue beneath the epithelium of the skin. So the epidermis and dermis are the two layers that make up skin. And a layer that's found nearby is the hypodermis. The hypodermis now is more connective tissue found just underneath the skin. So the epithelium of the skin and the connective tissue of the skin, epidermis and dermis, make up the two layers of skin. And then you have that third layer that's found nearby that we like to talk about here as well. And that's the hypodermis, and that's, you'll see connective tissue, and most of the time we'll see in certain locations of the body it will be made up of adipose. So when we talk epidermis, here we can see right up in here is epidermis. It's been peeled back up here. And then here you have the dermis. So this is the epithelium of skin, and this is the basically the connective tissue of skin, the dermis. And then here you have that other layer we consider as well, we said, the hypodermis, the subcutaneous fat you could think of. Okay, it's also known as, or subcutaneous tissue. Now when we go through and we talk about the epidermis, as you can see here, the epidermis is going to be the outermost layer. It's the outermost protective shield of the body. It's composed of epithelial cells. Now you're familiar with epithelial cells. The tissue type here is keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. Keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. And this tissue type, this keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium, is going to consist of 4 distinct cell types and anywhere from 4 to 5 distinct layers. And that's all dependent on where in the body we are at. Now, when we talk about the vascularity, if you recall, we said that this layer, the epidermis, is going to be avascular. Right? It's epithelial tissue. Now, when we talk about the cells, here, okay, now here what we'll do is we'll move over and we'll go through the different cells, and we'll see the superficial cells are going to be dead. If you recall, we've talked about that as well. We're not going to see nuclei there, and right, we've seen all that, and we'll check that out again. So avascular, nutrients are going to diffuse. We've already established this from the deeper connective tissue. And there's also very sparse nerve endings and sparse nerve endings. So here we'll go through the various cells, okay, and we'll check out all these different types of cells. Here you can actually go through and view some of the cells. Here we've got another image depicting those cells. and a third image depicting these cells. So we could use any of these pictures. This one's a little bit more zoomed in. We could use this one here. We'll start with first stem cells. Now stem cells, we're going to go through and we're going to see stem cells are going to be basically found dividing and producing new keratinocytes. And these stem cells are only found in the stratum basale. The stratum basale. The stratum basale, the basal layer you can think of, is the deepest layer of the epidermis. Like we said, it could be anywhere from 4 to 5 distinct layers. So the deepest layer is going to be the stratum basale. So we could look at that right in here. Right here you see the stem cells. Here we're coming through. Here's some more stem cells. So they're going to be producing all these keratinocytes we see here. And they're found in the deepest layer. So this is where the epithelium starts, right? Underneath here is all connective tissue. So here you can see the beginning point of epithelium, and we work all the way up. All the way up to here is epithelium. This is where we're going to go through. We're going to see, oh, it says it here, where we're going to find our dead keratinocytes. Right? We said they're not going to have any nuclei. One way to identify them, and you can see that here in this image also. Next, then we have our keratinocytes. Now, when we talk keratinocytes, we'll see our keratinocytes are going to be the most numerous cell type. And their function is that they synthesize this fibrous protein called keratin. Keratin is going to give the epidermis its protective properties. It protects the epithelial cells from damage. Where do we find these cells? Now, these keratinocytes, obviously only in keratinized stratified squamous epithelia, and they're going to arise from the stratum basale. They arise from the stratum basale, and they're going to be pushed. And they get pushed up. They're going to be pushed up as they grow, making their way all the way up to the highest layers right up here, the stratum corneum. Eventually they become dead by the time they get up there. And here you can see the stratum lucidum, also dead. And then right in here, the stratum granulosum is, you can see then where they're still alive, basically, and kind of making their way over to the other side. And then here you can see the stratum spinosum is where they're nice and healthy and doing their thing and growing, and basically you can think of their younger years versus the older years, and then on their way out, basically. And that's when skin sloughing is kind of happening. Next in here we can see we have our melanocytes. Now when we talk about melanocytes, melanocytes are spider-shaped epithelial cells. And these melanocytes, their function is that they synthesize this brown to black pigment called melanin. They make melanin. Melanin protects our DNA against UV. Melanin is taken up by our keratinocytes, and it's used to protect their DNA from UV. And then we obviously put sunblock and help give it even further protection. Now, where do we find melanocytes? Melanocytes are going to be found in the deepest layer, the stratum basale. They're found in the deepest layer. Next then we have dendritic cells. Now, when we talk dendritic cells, they're also known as Langerhans cells, also called Langerhans cells. These are described as being star-shaped cells. Star-shaped cells. And you can see here they're involved with immune surveillance. They're involved with immune surveillance. What they do is they protect us from microbes, from toxins, and from pathogens. Dendritic cells will protect us from microbes, toxins, and pathogens. They also have the ability to ingest these foreign substances. They also have the ability to ingest these foreign substances. And again, they activate our immune system. Now, where are they found? Location is that they arise from the bone marrow and they migrate to the epidermis. Now, in the epidermis, they can be found in the stratum spinosum and the stratum granulosum. And here you can see those dendritic cells. And they're found in higher abundance in the epithelia of the oral cavity, the esophagus, and the vagina. When you're reading, you'll see that as well. Next, then you have your tactile cells. Tactile cells, they're also known as your Merkel cells, and they're shaped like spiky hemispheres. They're shaped like spiky hemispheres. These cells, they're going to function as sensory receptors for touch. Sensory receptors for touch. Each tactile cell we'll see here is associated with a nerve ending. They're associated with a sensory nerve ending. Now the combination of the two is going to be known as the tactile or Merkel discs. So you have the cell itself, the nerve itself, but then when you talk about the two, it's the disc. And they're going to be found at the dermal junction, right? That deepest layer, only in the stratum basale. In that stratum basale only. Next, then, let's move to the layers. Let's discuss the layers here. Now, when we discuss the layers here, we'll see variation in epidermal thickness determines if the skin is thick skin or if the skin is thin skin. So the first layer that we've been talking about most famously is the stratum basale. Let's talk about the stratum basale first. The stratum basale is also known as the germinating layer. It's also known as the germinating layer. The stratum basale is attached to the dermis. So this layer right inside of here, it's attached to the dermis. And the stratum basale is basically just a single row of stem cells. Amongst these stem cells, we can also identify melanocytes we saw, keratinocytes that we have talked about, and our Merkel or tactile cells. The function of the stratum basale is that it regenerates new basal cells, right, in relation to the stem cells. That's the main function there. The melanocytes obviously have their protective function. Merkel cells, tactile cells will have their functions. Next then is the stratum spinosum. The stratum spinosum. The stratum spinosum is known as the prickly layer, and it's several layers thick. The cells that we have here will include keratinocytes and Langerhans cells, your epidermal dendritic cells. The function basically of this layer here, you can see now, is that its cells are going to contain thick bundles of intermediate filaments that are made of pre-keratin. So when you talk stratum spinosum, it contains Filaments of pre-keratin. Another depiction of the layers. You had the basale first, and then next we have the spinosum. Same thing we're seeing here. Basale, then spinosum. Next, then we're going to move to the stratum granulosum. To the stratum granulosum. Now, when we talk stratum granulosum, the stratum granulosum is anywhere from 3 to 6 cell layers thick. Anywhere from 3 to 6 cell layers thick. The cells you're going to find here are going to be keratinocytes. Keratinocytes. Now, when we talk keratinocytes, you can see here, now these cells, okay, their organelles are going to be deteriorating, as we saw. The cytoplasm is going to be full of basically granules and keratohyalin granules. So another depiction, and then we can see here as well. Granulosum. Next, then we have the stratum lucidum. The stratum lucidum is visible only in thick skin. It's visible only in thick skin. The stratum lucidum is a thin, translucent band or a zone. And when we talk about the cells here, the cells, you'll see it's basically made up of 2 to 3 rows of clear, flat, dead keratinocytes. Dead, flat keratinocytes. And you see that they're very obviously. Right above the stratum lucidum, then, we're going to see the stratum corneum. But before we jump to the stratum corneum, let's talk function here. Now, the function here is going to be basically it helps to kind of provide a little bit of protection and helps to stick that corneum to the granulosum a little bit better as well. So when you talk thick skin and thin skin, thick skin covers areas that are subject to abrasion. Areas such as the palms of our hands, our fingertips, right? And the soles of our feet. The epidermis of thick skin consists of 5 layers or 5 strata and a thicker stratum corneum. Now, when we talk thin skin is going to be found covering the rest of the body. It's found covering the rest of the body. And thin skin is going to be made up of 4 strata, or 4 layers, we can say there. And lastly, then we have the stratum corneum. The stratum corneum is the outermost layer. It could be anywhere from 20 to 30 cell layers thick. In some areas, it makes up about 3/4 of the epidermal thickness. The cells here, dead keratinocytes, completely dead keratinocytes, right? Now, the function of this layer is to protect us from abrasion, penetration, and dehydration. It protects us from abrasion, penetration, and dehydration. So that's all just the epidermis. Right? You never respected just the epidermis that much. See how much respect it demands. Beautiful. Beautiful skin. Beautiful. Let's move down to the dermis then. Now we talk dermis. Dermis is a second major skin region as we have described. The dermis is strong, flexible connective tissue. The dermis contains nerve fibers, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, hair follicles, and also oil and sweat glands. And when you talk vascularity, we'll see the dermis has a rich supply of blood vessels. Now, this dermis itself is going to get further subdivided. So let's move over. Okay, all basically taking us to then the dermis. Here we're going to hone in on the dermis a little bit more. Now you can see here the dermis is going to be further subdivided. It gets further subdivided into two layers. The dermal layers are going to include the more superficial layer, which is the papillary layer, and the layer that's found deeper to the papillary layer, the reticular layer. Now when we talk papillary layer, the papillary layer is the thin and superficial layer of the two. It's a thin and superficial layer. And the tissue type here, is areolar connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue. It will contain, you can see, collagen and elastic fibers. There's additional structures here we can appreciate. Blood vessels. We have also our dermal papillae. Our dermal papillae are these peg-like projections. These peg-like projections, they contain capillary loops. They contain the blood vessels. They also contain free nerve endings and touch receptors that are called tactile or Meissner's corpuscles. Now these dermal papillae themselves are going to, you'll see, be basically consistent of a couple of parts. You have first the dermal ridges and then the epidermal ridges. Now the dermal ridges are going to be in thick skin, and they're basically large mounds. They're large mounds found under the papillae. Also here the epidermal ridges. The epidermal ridges. The epidermal ridges are formed on the overlying epidermis. They're formed on the overlying epidermis due to the dermal ridges. Now collectively, these skin ridges, they're going to be referred to as friction ridges. These friction ridges are assumed to enhance the gripping ability. Friction ridge patterns are genetically determined, and they are unique to each of us. Now, when the sweat pores open along their crests, you can see all the sweat pores here. When they open along their crests, our fingertips leave identifying films of sweat that we call a fingerprint. Right, so thieves got smart and they started wearing gloves. We got smarter, Started getting DNA now. Next then are capillary loops. Capillary loops are blood-carrying vessels, and they allow for exchange to occur. The exchange of nutrients and waste and everything you have there that's running through the blood. Also here are free nerve endings. These free nerve endings are going to serve as pain receptors. Pain receptors. Also here are Meissner's corpuscles. Meissner's corpuscles. They are touch receptors. Touch receptors. Moving down from the papillary layer, then we have the reticular layer. The reticular layer, it accounts for about 80% of the dermal thickness. The tissue type we have here is basically irregular, dense, fibrous connective tissue. Dense, irregular, fibrous connective tissue. We went through in the last chapter and we discussed. Additional structures you're going to find in the reticular layer will include the cutaneous plexus. The cutaneous plexus is a network of blood vessels. It's a network of blood vessels which nourishes this layer. Which nourishes this layer. Also located here are flexure lines. And when we talk flexure lines are dermal folds. They are dermal folds that are going to occur at or near our joints, allowing for flexibility. So that then is your beautiful dermis. It's more fascinating than Disneyland. Look at all the beautiful structures in here. We're going to go through all these different glands as well. Let's talk hypodermis then next. When we talk hypodermis, hypodermis is the subcutaneous tissue found just deep to the skin. Found just deep to the skin. And it's known as the superficial fascia, also known as the superficial fascia. The tissue type, connective tissue, along, getting a little bit more specific, you can see a lot of adipose tissue. Right? When we want to give injections, some of our injections we want to give just intradermally. So we want to make sure they're in the dermis. Some are going to go subcutaneously into the subcutaneous tissue. And some are going to go intramuscularly, which is going to be into the muscle that's found beneath this adipose tissue. So when we go through and we talk hypodermis, mostly adipose tissue we see there. Its function is it stores fat, and it also anchors skin to muscle loosely so skin can move. Beautiful. I mean, beautiful system. I say that to every single one of them. The body's beautiful. Next then, let's talk skin color. Let's talk skin color. Now, when we talk skin color, there's three major pigments that contribute to skin color that we'll go through and we'll talk about, and they will include number 1, melanin, number 2, keratin, and then number 3, hemoglobin. Now, when we go through and we talk melanin, melanin is the only one that's made in the skin, and that's by melanocytes. It's produced by melanocytes. Melanin, you can see, is made up of a couple of, we've got a couple of different subtypes, eumelanin and pheomelanin. which is eumelanin is a brownish black pigment, and then pheomelanin is more of a reddish yellow pigment. Now, when we go through and we talk melanin, lack of melanocytes, right, and leading to then the skin tone not being there, right? That's when we go through and we talk individuals that have albinism, right? Their melanocytes are affected there. And here, when we go through and we talk across individuals, skin tones are going to vary due to the type of distribution of melanin. As we said, we have a couple of different subtypes, not the number of melanocytes. Okay. Now, when we go through and we talk second component here, the second component, second pigment is carotene. Carotene is a yellow to orange pigment. It's a yellow to orange pigment, and it's going to contain, you'll see, it's a yellow to orange pigment, and it's going to be found in certain plant foods. It's found in certain plant foods. So it's going to be found in contained in foods such as carrots, and it's a yellow to orange pigment. It's a yellow to orange pigment. We had one girl in med school with us during our third year when we actually had to rotate and go to hospitals and go to school as well. And she did a meal prep for herself, and she prepared Ziploc bags of carrots for basically the next 2 weeks for the rotation. And every day she would bring, a bag, and she had some at home, so she'd bring a couple of bags, and she'd be eating carrots all day. Finally, at the end of the week, a week and a half, this young lady who had more of an orange skin tone. Then obviously stopped eating them, when she noticed this, and it then it basically went away. The pigment was removed from the body then, instead of having that accumulation occur. Next then is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is going to be a pigment which contains oxygen in the red blood cells. Hemoglobin is a pigment which contains oxygen. It's going to be found in our red blood cells. Now, with a lack of hemoglobin in the body, this gives you a little bit of a pale look. It gives you a little bit of a pale look. And this is quite common in individuals who have sometimes gastric bleeds, gastric ulcers, and they don't notice the ulcer, the bleed happening, and their skin tone starts to become pale and they look sick then. So you can see how all three pigments are going to contribute to skin color. Next, let's move to the appendages of the skin. Let's move to the appendages of the skin. Now, when we go through and we talk appendages of the skin, we're going to talk about hair, follicles, hair, nails, and all of that stuff. Before we jump down there, here's some diagnostic skin colors I want you to be familiar with as well. Cyanosis is a blueness, and it's usually due to lack of oxygen. Erythema is a redness to the skin due to increased blood flow. And then pallor is a pale or ashen skin color, and that's due to reduced blood flow. Albinism, white, genetic lack of melanin. And then jaundice, a yellowing, due to liver and bilirubin problems. And then hematoma is a bruise. Some skin markings I want you to be familiar with as well. We talked about friction ridges, flexion lines as well. Freckles then, you have there, moles, and hemangiomas, basically birthmarks. I want you to be familiar with as well. So let's talk then appendages of the skin. Now, when we talk appendages of the skin, here we'll go through and we'll talk first about hair and then hair follicles. Now, where is hair found? So we're talking location on the body. Hair is going to be found distributed over our entire skin surface except for our palms, except for our soles of our feet, except for the soles of our feet, our lips, the nipples, and parts of the external genitalia. These areas will all be hair free. The function, what's the function of hair? Hair is going to help keep it's going to help keep mammals warm. It will help keep mammals warm. Its main function is that it helps to sense insects. It helps to sense insects on the skin before they can bite us or sting us. On the scalp, it's going to guard against physical trauma. It guards against heat loss, and it protects us against sunlight. Our eyelashes, they shield the eyes. Nose hairs, they filter large particles like lint and insects from the air that we breathe. Around the ears, they're going to protect insects from making their way into the ear, along with the wax. Now, when we go through and we talk about the structure, we talk about the structure of hair. Hair is basically flexible strands that are produced by hair follicles. They're flexible strands produced by hair follicles. And hairs are going to consist of, are going to consist of mostly or largely dead keratinized cells. Dead keratinized cells. So the type of cell, the cell type we'll have in relation to the structure of hairs are mostly dead keratinized cells. So we can see here various functions we can see here as well. Okay, same thing we've got here as we mentioned also. Now let's look at the structure in greater detail. When we look at the structure in greater detail, here we can see hair has got two chief regions, two main regions. And these two main regions are going to include first the hair shaft. First you have the hair shaft. And the hair shaft is the area that projects from the skin. It's the area that projects from the skin. And it extends. Here you can see it extends. So it projects from the skin. And it extends about halfway down into the follicle. So it's the portion that's embedded in the skin. It's the chief region. It's the main region of our hair. Here is where keratinization is complete. Here is where keratinization is complete. Then when we talk about the root, the root is found from the shaft down to the bulb area. It's the region running from the shaft down to the bulb area. This will be the hair root. The hair root is where you have ongoing keratinization. Our hairs will have 3 layers to their structure. They have 3 layers to their structure. So here we can appreciate that in greater detail from this view. So go through and get all this down there as well that we've gone through. We're still going to talk about hair follicles in greater detail, but these parts here is what we're going to go through now. So here we can see the 3 layers. First layer is the medulla. Now when we talk about the medulla is basically the central core of your hair. So here we did a transverse cut through here. Here you can appreciate the hair. Here's the medulla of the hair. It's found at the central core. Makes up the central core. It consists of large cells and air spaces, as we can see. It consists of large cells and air spaces. Surrounding the medulla is going to be the cortex. The cortex. Now, when we talk about the cortex is the bulky layer. It's the bulky layer. And it's going to consist of several layers of flattened cells. It consists of several layers of flattened cells. Surrounding that cortex then is going to be the cuticle. The cuticle. Now we talk about the cuticle. The cuticle is a single layer of cells that overlap like shingles on a roof. And this is the most keratinized part. This part provides strength to the hair. This is where the hair conditioners come and work at. Next, then, let's talk about the follicle that houses the hair. So the follicle, you can see it folds down. The follicles, they fold down. They fold down from the epidermal surface into the dermis. In the scalp, they go all the way down to the hypodermis sometimes. Now, the location within the integument, these hair follicles, again, epidermis, extending down to the dermis. So let's go through the wall of the follicle. When we talk about the wall of the follicle, here we can see we already checked out the hair. So here we've got the follicle wall now. We can do the same thing from here. It's going to be all right out here. So we talk about the follicle wall. The wall is going to consist of first the peripheral connective tissue sheath, which is also known as the fibrous sheath. And it's derived from the dermis. It's derived from the dermis. You can appreciate that right outside of here. Next, then we have the glassy membrane. The glassy membrane. Now, when we talk about the glassy membrane is the thickened basal lamina. It's the thickened basal lamina. So again, the glassy membrane, we can see internal to the connective tissue root sheath, is the thickened basal lamina. Next, here we have the epithelial root sheath. The epithelial root sheath, now we can see here, is going to get divided up into two parts. The epithelial root sheath, we can see here, gets divided up into an external epithelial root sheath, we can see here, and an internal epithelial root sheath we see right inside of here. The internal epithelial root sheath, along with the external, they start to thin out. So here you can appreciate the two, external and the internal epithelial root sheath, and they start to thin out as they make their way towards the bulb, as they start making their way towards the bottom here of the bulb. Next, then you have the hair bulb. When we talk hair bulb, so you can see here where it zoomed in basically on the bulb. Now, we talk hair bulb, it's the expanded deep end. It's the expanded deep end of the follicle. Here we can appreciate the hair follicle receptor. When we talk about the hair follicle receptor, we can see now this hair follicle receptor is also known as the root hair plexus. Also known as the root hair plexus. And what it is it's a knot of sensory nerve endings. It's a knot of sensory nerve endings that wrap basket-like around each hair bulb. And they're going to detect the bending of hairs. So whenever a mosquito or fly comes and sits on the hair, that causes the hair to bend, and that gets then detected by our nervous system. Next then we have the hair papilla. Now the hair papilla is a nipple-like bit. It's this nipple-like bit of dermal tissue that protrudes up into the hair bulb. And you can see found on top of it is the hair matrix. The hair matrix. The hair matrix now is the actively dividing area of the bulb that produces the hair. And we can see lots of melanocytes in here as well. Next then is the erector pili or piloerector muscle. This is a bundle of smooth muscle cells, basically, a bundle of smooth muscle cells that are associated with each hair follicle. And these muscles are responsible for giving us the goosebump appearance. So here what happens is when the muscle contracts, pulls on this side and pulls on this side, gets the hair to stand up and causes a dimpling in the skin by it pulling basically on some of that skin there. Next then here, we're going to be able to appreciate nails. So you could go through types of hair and get down the idea of variation in types of hair. When we go through, we talk types of hair, we are able to appreciate vellus hair and terminal hair, basically the two main types. And then we'll move down to nails. Let's move down to nails. Now, when we talk nails, nails are a scale-like modification. They are a scale-like modification of the epidermis, and they form a clear protective covering. The function, or I'm sorry, let's jump to the function. Let's talk location. They're going to be found on the distal, dorsal, fingers, and toes. The function is they function as tools. They function as tools, and they help us to pick up things or scratch an itch, whatever it may be there. Let's go through the structure of the nail. This is a good image. This one is good as well. This one is a little bit better. Here you can actually appreciate the free edge of the nail. Now we talk about the free edge of the nail. That's the most distal part of the nail. This is the part that we trim. This leads us then to the body of the nail. The body, you can see, is the main part of the nail. Then we have the root. The root we have down here, the root is found under the nail fold. It's found under the nail fold. Then we have the nail matrix. The nail matrix, it's responsible for growth. And here you have the cuticle, the eponychium. It's part of the proximal nail fold that projects onto the nail body. Next then we have the hyponychium. The hyponychium. Now the hyponychium is going to be the region beneath the free edge of the nail. It's the region beneath the free edge of the nail. This is where dirt and debris likes to accumulate. Next then let's move to sweat glands. Let's talk about our sweat glands. When we talk sweat glands are also known as sudoriferous glands. They're also known as sudoriferous glands. When we talk sweat glands are distributed over the entire skin surface. They're distributed over the entire skin surface except for our nipples and part of our external genitalia. The first type of gland that we'll talk about here will be our eccrine glands. We see here our eccrine glands. Our eccrine sweat glands, they look like apocrine glands. They are merocrine sweat glands. These eccrine sweat glands are very numerous and abundant. They're very numerous and abundant. Another image depicting them. The location on the body, they're found in the palms and the soles of our feet and forehead, but widely distributed over the entire body, So mainly palms, soles of the feet, and the forehead, but widely distributed over the entire body. Now the location within the integument, these glands we can see are going to be found in the dermis, sometimes hypodermis. The function of these eccrine glands, these eccrine sweat glands, they secrete sweat, which is 99% water, sodium chloride, vitamin C, antibodies, metabolic wastes such as ammonia, uric acid, urea, and then even certain drugs. Now, thermal regulation, temperature regulation, is the major function, the major role of these eccrine sweat glands. Next then we have our apocrine sweat glands. Now when we talk apocrine sweat glands, there's only around 2,000 of these glands, and they are larger than the eccrine glands. Now when you talk location on the body, they're found in the axillary, the anal genital areas, the groin, the areola, and the beard area in mature males. These apocrine sweat glands, they're found located within the integument in the deep dermis and hypodermis. Now their precise function is unknown. We believe they're also involved with thermal regulation. Now these glands, they secrete sweat, which has fatty substances and proteins. These secretions are quite viscous, they're quite thick. They're quite viscous, they're quite thick, and they're sometimes even milky or yellowish in color. These secretions are odorless, but when decomposed by bacteria on the skin, they're going to give off this musky, unpleasant odor that we refer to as body odor. The next type are your ceruminous glands. Our ceruminous glands are going to be modified apocrine glands. They're modified apocrine glands. Location of the body, they're going to be found in the lining of the external ear canal. Found in the lining of the external ear canal. And their function is that they're going to secrete secretions that mix with sebum from our sebaceous glands. And then they form this sticky substance that we call cerumen or earwax. And that cerumen or earwax is a sticky substance, as we said, and it's there to help repel substance, basically insects and other animals from coming into the ear. Doesn't always work. I can't tell you how many times I've taken bugs out of people's ears. Next then are mammary glands. We talk mammary glands. They're specialized sweat glands. They're properly a part of the integumentary system, but we're also going to consider them again when we get to the female reproductive system. So the location on the body is within the breast, and their function will be to produce milk. Next then are our sebaceous glands. When we talk sebaceous glands are also known as oil glands. They are simple branched alveolar glands, and they develop from hair follicles, and they become active at puberty. Location on the body, They're found all over the body except in thick skin of the palms and soles. We have a few on the trunk, few on the limbs, mostly on the face, neck, and upper chest area as well. Location within the integument, they're found, you can see here, I told you in the last lecture as well, found next to a follicle or near a pore. Their function is to secrete sebum. They are a type of halocrine gland, and we discussed halocrine glands in the last lecture, how they destroy themselves after secreting. Next then we have the functions. Functions. So we went through all these different glands. Next we have functions of the integumentary system. Now when we talk about functions of basically skin and integumentary system, number one, it's protection. Protection or resistance to trauma and infection. Now, protection or resistance to trauma and infection is going to be accomplished by three barriers, thanks to three barriers. The first barrier is going to be thanks to chemical barriers. Chemical barriers. Now, when we talk chemical barriers, this includes secretions such as defensins and low pH secretions, along with secretions melanin. Then we have physical barriers. Physical barriers are keratin and glycolipids and glycolipids. And then you have third, your biological barriers. Biological barriers are your dendritic cells and macrophages. Dendritic cells and macrophages. Another function is body temperature regulation, thermal regulation. Heat is going to be released via sweat, and cold is going to be battled via dermal blood vessel constriction to keep the heat in. Metabolic functions as well. Metabolic functions now are going to include vitamin D synthesis and chemical conversions. Basically synthesis of vitamin D thanks to UV exposure, right after UV exposure, so UV is important. Blood reservoir. Excuse me. Here we'll see skin and integumentary system is going to act as a blood reservoir. And not only blood reservoir, but also water retention. We'll see the skin and the integumentary system. The dermis has an extensive vascular supply. It holds about 5% of our body's blood. And then water retention, it's going to prevent water overload. Right? Water overload during bathing and then also dehydration. Excretion. The skin is going to be excreting ammonia and urea, we said, in sweat. Mostly in urine, but sweat as well, along with that water and salt. Sensation, we saw there. Nonverbal communication as well. And nonverbal communication. Here we have some skin disorders in relation to the integumentary system. I want you to go through and understand acne. How acne is inflammation of the sebaceous glands. Okay, and it goes through and mentions basically everything you have going on in relation to those pimples or acne. And then dermatitis, inflammation basically in relation to the skin. Eczema, it's itchy, red, weeping skin lesions that are caused by an allergy. And then psoriasis. Okay, recurring reddened plaques covered with a silvery scale. Autoimmune, usually, runs in the family. Ringworm then, fungal infection. Rosacea, red rash-like area. Usually you're in the area of the nose and cheeks. And then warts, benign, elevated, rough lesions caused by HPV. And then we talked abnormal skin coloration, birthmarks, burns, we'll get into and we'll see here. And then here's a couple of skin conditions, pemphigus vulgaris, skin cancer. And then we have polythelia and polymastia here as well. So here we can see skin cancers, they're induced by UV rays, both natural and by tanning beds. Elderly and fair skin, most common. We have three major types: basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and malignant melanoma.